My name is Christopher Meyer. I'm a high conflict family law attorney. I represent kids and children walking through trauma, domestic violence situations, and high conflict child custody situations. I grew up in the CPS system. When I was 7 years old, my parents dropped me off at a police station with just a suitcase, and I understand what it feels like to have the family situation fall apart and the state have to step in. And I carry some of that trauma with me today, but I know it's nothing compared to what others have experienced and have gone through. That is why I'm having the conversation today. Today's focus is not about me, but on someone who has turned unimaginable pain into powerful action for our community. I'm joined today by Rhonda Kirkendall. She is the task force director for the Anti-Trafficking Collective. She is also a survivor leader, licensed social worker, and also a TEDx speaker. And very important, I am going to share the QR code to her TEDx talk on my website, and also a link to that video down in the comments. So please take a look at that. I watched it today. It's a very powerful message. Rhonda is also a legislative advocate. She helped abolish the statute of limitations for childhood sexual assault in Texas. So I want to give you a high five on that one. Made a lot of people nervous in Texas.
Right.
But she's also one of the most respected voices in human trafficking. She is also the bridge for law enforcement and victim services, victim service providers, and communities to ensure that kids and families get the trauma-informed help that they need. Rhonda, thank you for being here today. I'm really honored. You're my first guest in the new studio. So tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, let's see. I have grown up in Fort Bend County. I met my husband very, very early on. I met him when I was 12 years old. I married him when I was 16. So we've been married almost 40 years. Actually, August 2nd will be 40 years.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. And so it took me a whole lot of time of working on healing before I could come out and be the advocate that I do today. So it has been a long process. I am the mother of two children who are both married. I am a brand new Gigi. My grandbaby is 5 months old. And in my spare time, I love to ride motorcycles and scuba dive.
Okay. Well, that's very, very fascinating. I did read about you, and I watched some of your videos. You have been through unimaginable pain, and I respect and honor the fact that you have turned this into action. I'd like for you to tell the listeners about the Anti-Trafficking Collective, and what does your day-to-day actually look like?
Sure. I first started volunteering with the Fort Bend County District Attorney's Office as a volunteer. It was called the Fort Bend County District Attorney Human Trafficking Community Awareness Team. Really, really long name. But my role in that was to bring awareness to our communities in Fort Bend County about human trafficking in general. And during that time is when I volunteered for the DA's office. I went back to school and I got my master's in social work. And nearing the same time that I was finishing up my degree, Fort Bend County was blessed to receive a grant from the Department of Justice. It's called an enhanced collaborative model. We are working with the Department of Justice to bring about a new human trafficking task force here in Fort Bend County. What we have seen historically, and not only here in Fort Bend County, or not even across Texas, but across the nation, is that we have victim service providers and law enforcement that are not in the same room. They are working in silos and they're not talking to each other. The purpose of this task force is for us to work on building trust, breaking down barriers, and coming together for both the prosecution side to make sure that traffickers are prosecuted, and also on the victim service providers, that we are making sure that we are putting in meaningful change to help survivors, because survivors of trafficking have a lot of different needs. And they can start out with a need for housing, a need for shelter, a need for food. You can't worry about a survivor going back to college if she doesn't have a place to lay her head. And so it really is working from the ground up to help on all those different levels or systems, always making sure that we respect the agency and what the victim wants to do in their life.
Okay. What would you say pulled you into this work?
I'm a survivor of familial trafficking. I was trafficked when I was 10 years old. It took me a lot of years before I found out that my parents were actually paid for my trafficking. And so when I came to an age where I wanted to report the crime, I was past the statute of limitations. And that's where I began working on that legislative change to abolish the statute of limitations. And it was abolishing it for child sexual assault. My abuse happened in the 80s when the word trafficking did not even exist. So on the federal level, the trafficking statute wasn't put in place until the year 2000. Texas adopted it in 2003. So if you can imagine what I was going through, there wasn't even a language to describe it. When you look at my perpetrator, he has been convicted 4 times, 3 different states. So he's been convicted Texas, Kansas, California, and back in Texas. All of his charges are what you would consider trafficking related: sexual performance by a child, compelling prostitution, aggravated child sexual assault. And that is because that trafficking statute did not exist back then.
A technical question. You had this new law passed so there's no longer a statute of limitations, but is it retroactive?
It is not.
Oh, so it's only like new.
Yes. I knew early on that the law that I changed would not help me.
Okay.
And when I was going through this, I actually kept a journal. And not too long ago, and I went back and I read that journal, and I was really surprised at how dark I was when I was trying to figure out what to do. How I was so frustrated that the very agencies that I felt were put in place in this world to help, law enforcement, prosecutors, district attorneys, they all told me I was too late. And so when I found out that it wasn't going to help me, I knew that I would probably never even know when it did help that person, right? If you think about it, whenever I was working in this field, the statute of limitations was 10 years from your 18th birthday. So as soon as you were older than 28 years old, you couldn't go forward. And I was 34 when I came forward. So I was just about 6 years too late. And so I knew that once this law went into effect, it went into effect September 2007, that it would take at least 28 years for it to really take full effect when that person is 29, 30, 31 years old, and they could press charges against their perpetrator.
Okay, so I know this is my public school education showing. So 60, 14, 10. So 2035?
Exactly. Yes, it would be decades before I would really know. But I want to say, how many years ago now? Probably 3 or 4 years ago. I was sitting in my living room. I was working on my laptop, and I got a Facebook message. And that Facebook message said, "You don't know me, but we are friends on Facebook. And because of the law that you passed so many years ago, I was able to have my day in court last week."
Wow.
So she was able to come forward and press charges. So that was extremely emotional, because I thought I would never even know who they are. Or, I've spent a lot of time working in child welfare. So I've been in court cases before, or watching trials, and hearing the judge say to the jury, and the instructions to the jury before they deliberate, I just telling the jury that there is no statute of limitations for child sexual assault. It really is kind of surreal. I kind of look around hey, that was me. I did it. I don't, of course, say that, but I mean,
No, you did do it. And we thank you for it.
Well, and I think it's one of those things where you realize that if I could have gone forward and pressed charges on my trafficker, I probably would have never sought changing a law and doing the legislative advocacy work that I do today. It would have helped me. It would have helped my perpetrator's victims. But By not being able to do that, we changed the law. So now it can help untold numbers of people. That's the beauty of legislative advocacy. Sometimes it's not that glamorous to be working in legislative advocacy, but when you look at the lifelong consequences when you change a law and how many people it helps in the future, it's very profound.
Well, it kind of goes to my earlier statement. You've experienced unimaginable pain, but turned that into powerful action. Okay, so question: when people hear about human trafficking, what do they usually get wrong?
The sad fact is that the majority of people will look on social media platforms to understand what human trafficking is. Even within the news media, they still get it wrong, especially when we're talking about the difference between human trafficking and human smuggling. When you look at TikTok, Instagram, you think of these kidnapping, you think of abductions, you think of white vans with darkened windows, you think of chains and ropes. And the reality is that the majority of trafficking happens through a coercion of the mind. And so you will not see those chains. I try to tell people that I went to school every day. I lived at home. I came and went, but I was still being trafficked and no one saw me.
No, I understand. As a domestic violence lawyer, that's if that kind of falls under manipulation, where it's they're not being physically abducted, but again, it's manipulation of the mind. But I do want to ask you, how does trafficking show up in our backyards, the CPS child welfare system? How does it show up in our schools, our subdivisions? And also, I want to point out that Houston is the fourth largest city in the country. We're a very international city. We have folks from every country here. They live here, and they kind of bring their own cultural background, where maybe things back home in the old country are more accepted over there. It's just the way it was, or they're just CPS. The CPS just doesn't exist in many countries, so child abuse and exploitation, it happened to a lot of people, but there was just no legal mechanism in place to take care of them. And you mentioned something about familial connection that was a factor in your own trauma. So I guess my question is could it also be like a, I don't want to use the word cultural issue, but it's just that we have folks from every part of the world where things are different levels of acceptance. And we see that here. For example, maybe someone brings a family member over here from another country. They hold their passport. They're not allowed to really learn English. They're not allowed to earn money. Basically, a domestic servant. And how does that overlap into human trafficking?
I think it's important that we really define what human trafficking is.
Mhm.
And so human trafficking is when a person compels another person through force, fraud, or coercion to engage in commercial sex or forced labor. Commercial sex is when you exchange sex for something of value. And many times that is money, but it could also be a place to stay. It could be food to eat. It could be a debt owed. And when you're looking at minors, and it's important to understand that the trafficking statute in the state of Texas, a minor is considered under the age of 18. In other parts of the penal code, a minor is considered under the age of 17, but for trafficking, it's under the age of 18. When you have someone that's under the age of 18 that is engaged in commercial sex, it is trafficking 100% of the time, because that minor cannot consent to have sex. Now, when you look at forced labor, which, we talk a lot about sex trafficking, but the precedents of the incidences of labor trafficking are more than sex trafficking, but we don't talk about it. There is not an age limit on labor trafficking because, simply put, minors can work, right? A 16-year-old can work. So you have to prove force, fraud, or coercion in order to prove that labor trafficking has occurred. So when you look at the way that traffickers work, whether it is in our schools, in our subdivisions, traffickers will look for vulnerabilities. And when you have an increase in vulnerabilities, you will have an increase for the risk of being trafficked. We always talk in numbers, and this is a difficult subject to quantify, because even the research and the data that we've been looking at, it is only in reported numbers. And the majority of victims will never self-identify. And so we have to always keep that in our memory, in our mind, that when you look at data and statistics, there is so much that can't be quantified. When you look at like our schools, you want to look at the predominance of intersectionalities with people of color or child welfare systems, juvenile justice systems, marginalized communities. Does that mean that somebody that lives in a gated community with two parents can't be trafficked? Absolutely not. Back when I was trafficked, my perpetrator had to come into physical contact to groom me. Today, you don't have that. Today, we have social media. Today, we have TikTok. We have Instagram, where we have seen historically that traffickers will go fishing, meaning they will send out 300 messages. It's the same exact message to everybody, and they're going to see who's going to bite. Once somebody bites, they're going to troll your social media and find out what your vulnerabilities are. Did you not make a sports team? You wanted to be on the swim team in school, or you broke up with your boyfriend, or you're in a fight with your parents, or you want to be a singer, or you want to be a model. That's what was said to me when I was 10 years old. Do you want to be a model? So they will look for all of these ways to very much individualize their grooming with you to where you do not even realize what's happening. When I see an abduction, and we fight this all the time, people that want to show children and women getting abducted, we hear it a lot, like, be careful when you go to Target. There are so many people that post things on social media for the purpose of getting likes. Here in Fort Bend County, we hear sex trafficking at Katy Mills Mall. I assure you, if there were traffickers trolling Katy Mills Mall, grabbing and abducting children and women, we would hear about it from the police. That actually is not happening. What you see around Katy Mills Mall, and this isn't exclusive to Katy Mills Mall, it's a lot of different parts of our country, is where you will have a mall, but then you have all these hotels around the mall. And that's where we see sex trafficking going. So much of sex trafficking is done through online ads, where they will make a phone call and they will agree where to meet. They will meet at one of those places around Katy Mills Mall. Anywhere where you see a big grouping of hotels or motels, you can see an increase in trafficking. And you had mentioned the size of Houston, and we hear so much about it's a hub. The reality is that trafficking follows population explosion. So anywhere that you see large amounts of people, you're going to see a prevalence in trafficking. We hear this data and this number. I think it comes from the Polaris Project, where Texas is the second most reported cases of child sex trafficking in the nation. We are also the second largest state in the nation. Who was first? California. So you have to kind of keep that in mind also, that when you see more people, you're going to have an increase in incidences as well.
Well, that makes sense. Makes perfect sense. Okay, question. So if someone is listening right now and they want to help do something more than just raise awareness to prevent human trafficking, what realistic things can they actually do?
The most important thing to do is to first educate yourself. Go offline, so get off social media. Don't look for your access to social media. Look for peer-reviewed journals. The Fort Bend Anti-Trafficking Collective is a wonderful resource for you. One of the things that we are working on right now is to have a section of our Facebook group to be dedicated to where can people find really good vetted information to understand what trafficking is. The next thing I would do is educate your family. If you have kids in your home, make them understand. Get them to know what is sextortion. How does grooming occur? Personally, I would never, ever let my child be connected to the internet in their bedroom. We would have a policy in our home that anything connected to the internet will be out in the common area of the home. That is where the majority of grooming happens. You have to begin to normalize the conversation around this. Because when you normalize it, you begin talking about it all the time. You can start at a very, very young age by talking about safety. And then as they get older, share with them more information. Give them scenarios and say, what would you do? There's a really good resource. We have Street Grace is the name of the nonprofit. They are in Georgia. They're in Louisiana. They're here in Texas. They have a booklet, and it's Keeping Kids Safe in the Digital Age. I absolutely love this because it is a free resource for parents and caregivers to where it goes through and explains what each of these things are. What is trafficking? What is grooming? What is sextortion? And the beauty of this booklet is not only in the knowledge that it gives, but it ends each chapter in like a discussion so that helps the parent and the child, the caregiver and the child begin to normalize. How do we talk about this? Once you get finished with the book, I wouldn't stop talking. I would find something else to discuss. Of course, not every time you're with your child, right? I mean, part of my work before I got this job with the district attorney's office as the task force director, I worked for Texas CASA. And we created a program called the ACT program, the Anti-Child Trafficking Program. We created best practices and protocols for CASA, court-appointed special advocates. This is an organization that provides volunteers that work with kids that are in the child welfare system. How can we engage these programs to be able to look out and watch for trafficking as well within that population? All of those resources, the guidebooks, they are open sourced, so anybody can gain access to them and start reading them now.
Okay. And if you wouldn't mind, if there's any resources you want me to share with listeners, just feel free to send me
Sure.
links or
Sure.
pamphlets or whatever, and I'll happily share it on my website and also down in the links or down in the comments. And also understand you're putting on a anti-trafficking collective summit on July 30th. What types of collaboration between law enforcement and service providers do you hope to strengthen?
So we really have good support from our law enforcement victim service providers here in Fort Bend County. The Anti-Trafficking Collective will have 5 victim service providers providing direct services to adult victims, and that is Unbound Now, YMCA International, BCFS, The Landing, and then United Against Human Trafficking. At the same time, Fort Bend County has been given a grant through the governor's office to provide care coordination for minor victims of trafficking. That will be done through Child Advocates of Fort Bend. We will have an entire care coordination team. All of these things are being built right now. And they're being built right now to make sure that we have this collaborative approach. So this summit that we're doing is for internal partners within the ATC to be able to help us learn to trust each other and to build those networks. Really, when things go wrong, and they're going to go wrong, they are going to go wrong. We want both sides to say, let's assume the best interest of that other party and have a conversation. Let's work through when things do not go well and mitigate those and fix them as we're going through these cases and their trials. These are not easy cases. These are very difficult. It's a difficult area to work in. There is no way one organization, one agency can do it alone. It will take that multidisciplinary team concept to get this done.
Okay, well, maybe you've already kind of answered this question, but why is it so important that these different systems like law enforcement, schools, CPS, advocates actually talk to each other and respond in a trauma-informed way?
I can share the importance of that by sharing a little bit about my own personal story. And that is that when I decided to come forward, when I felt like I was strong enough to go public with what happened to me, I became almost obsessed with finding out the why. Why did it happen? How did it happen? And so I began to get together police records, hospital records, court records. And what I found out is that I told people. I didn't remain completely silent. I was seen at UTMB Galveston where I gave them the name of my perpetrator. My perpetrator, his name is actually listed in my hospital records. Several years after that, my father was fighting for custody of my younger sister. There was a custody trial. I told court officials. I gave them his name. I attempted suicide as a freshman in high school. I was forced to see a therapist. I gave them this information. Everybody stayed in their lane. And although I understand staying in your lane has a purpose, nobody thought outside of the box. They just did their job, and they did not see what was happening to us. CPS knew of it as well, and nobody helped. That is why this collaboration is so important. And I can tell you, When I first started working in this field, and I've been on the board of directors for Child Advocates of Fort Bend now for almost 7 years. When I started working in this field, I used to say my story wouldn't happen again. I would have been taken to get a forensic interview. Outside agencies would have helped me. But the more I've worked in this field and I've seen what goes on across this country, it literally takes one person, one agency, either not identifying what's going on or not doing their job. And kids can still fall through the cracks today because exploiters exploit those gaps that are in the systems.
Okay. Well, it sounds like your experience, what you went through, there was no trauma informed response. It was nothing. But what should a truly trauma informed response look like in real life?
When you're working with victims of trafficking, especially like on the sex trafficking side, you're not going to be faced with somebody that is going to thank you for getting involved. The majority of the time, victims of trafficking, every single system in their life has failed them. And you're one more person that's going to do that. And so it's vitally important that we approach these cases with a non-judgmental frame of reference, that we understand trauma-informed care, that we understand how the brain responds to trauma and why victims act the way they do. I remember the first time I went through trauma-informed training, and it was almost like this light bulb moment because it was giving words to actually how I felt. And I had never heard it before. It made me understand why I reacted the way I do. It made me understand why I don't remember everything, why I can't give you a linear story from beginning to end. Trauma-informed care will teach providers, will teach law enforcement why a victim may be fuzzy on details. It isn't dishonesty. It's literally our brain's way of protecting ourselves, that we have gaps in our memory. I have a very vivid memory of the first time that I was flown to Lubbock. Down to, I can tell you what I was wearing and what shoes I was wearing as a 10-year-old. And I have zero memory of being flown home. I know I was flown home, but I can't remember it. It's gone. And so that's where this understanding of trauma-informed care, where you come at it with this non-judgmental, it helps victims to be able to trust. When you're looking at cases, particularly of familial sex trafficking, and so you have trafficking, but when a family member is involved, that makes it familial. And a family member can be biological, right? It could be a mother or a father, but it could also be legal. It could be a step parent. It could be a foster care parent. And the studies that are coming out right now here locally, RTI International has done some amazing research on human trafficking and familial trafficking, and also the Institute for Shelter Care. They did a study on familial sex trafficking and found that 65% of the perpetrators were biological mothers. And in that study, what that meant was it didn't necessarily mean that the biological mother was the trafficker, but it could mean that they knew about it, profited from it, or refused to report it to law enforcement. That didn't intersect with my story. I had a trafficker, but my trafficker paid my mother for what happened.
Would you say trauma-informed responses have gotten better in Fort Bend County?
Yeah. I think that one of the work that Child Advocates of Fort Bend did was that they're trying to create a trauma-informed community. Imagine that. They have the CAPC program. CAPC is a child abuse prevention collaborative. It's a new organization in Fort Bend County where there's an entire website to be able to get resources and services that focus in on trauma-informed care. I am a voice for both adult and minor victims of both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And so CAPC is a really, really great resource for minor victims. One of the things that we are working on right now with Crime Stoppers of Houston is to create a Houston area human trafficking resource guide, a resource guide that can be used across law enforcement, victim service providers, survivors to be able to get services and get help for human trafficking.
When this resource guide for CAPC is available, just send it to me. I'll make it available and attach it to your interview. Okay. So tell me, what keeps you What keeps you motivated on the hard days, knowing that trauma is not going to go away? It's not going to disappear. Trauma is there. It happens in our community, and we expect it to happen again. We can minimize it, but it's so. What keeps you going on these hard days?
I count it a privilege and an honor to be able to work in the job that I do. That I am trying to create best practices and protocols in the very community where I was harmed. And that leaves a different level of importance. This is not a job to me. This is something that I will work on to do to the best of my ability for the lasting effect that it will have for people that come after me. I spent the majority of my life, and hopefully one day it won't be the majority. I was probably in my mid-30s that I went around expecting to be harmed. I didn't understand that with trauma, you carried it in your body. And so I didn't realize that the majority of the time my shoulders would be up in my ears. And it was almost this fight or flight stance that I constantly lived in. It was my norm. If I walked into the post office or a grocery store, the first thing I do without even thinking about it was scan just to see if there's anybody around that looked like they could hurt me. That type of trauma to where when I began to understand what was happening to me, I literally would have to tell myself, put your shoulders down, put your shoulders down, put your shoulders down. Now I don't have to say it as much anymore. But there was this day where I had been working on legislation for human trafficking. And it was almost like this epiphany. And I walked out of the back door of my house, and I just remember thinking, there are more good people in the world than bad people. And I don't think I ever understood that. And I think that's a very sad commentary of where I was. But when you grow up at a very, very early age in such fear and darkness, all of the horrible, horrific things that happen in the world, I began to understand that there are horrific things that happen, and they probably always will. That's the nature of life. But there are amazing human beings. There are wonderful advocates. There are people out there in the world working to help victims. And that's where I find comfort. And I also am blessed to be able to meet people like you, people that work in this field. I mean, other people that are trying to pave a path to help victims in the future.
Amen. Amen to that. Okay, so can you tell me what gives you hope, and how communities like Fort Bend are responding today compared to when you were a child?
Working with law enforcement has been interesting. When you take it from a background where I literally watched my dad get handcuffed and taken away by police, that you have this thing that goes on in your brain where your brain is like, no, intelligently, academically, law enforcement is good. As a child, I saw them as somebody that hurt me. And so trying to get over all of that. I just went through this training here in Fort Bend County, and it's training for law enforcement. But as a task force director, I'm allowed to come in and participate in the training. And we did like a human trafficking 101, and we really focused in on what trafficking is, how law enforcement can address it. And when it was over, I had about 5 officers walk up to me and said, I'm going to change what I do on patrol. I'm going to change. Right now, I'm thinking about a case that could have been human trafficking that I didn't see back then. We are making strides. This anti-trafficking collective, once we get it up and going, so we are in the steering committee phase right now. So we are creating all of the organizational documents, the standard operating procedures, the committees. Once we begin, that will be a lasting change. We are doing some amazing good jobs here in Fort Bend County. And I have to tell you, there was a time where we had top law enforcement officials saying it didn't even exist here. Can you imagine, as a victim of that crime, hearing somebody say that?
Unimaginable.
Yeah, it was tough, but we've come a long way since then. We've come a long way in a very short period of time, to be quite honest with you. And so we are only going to be moving upwards because we are going to be training more law enforcement. We are working on community awareness events as well. That's all in our training platform under the ATC.
Okay. And I look forward to attending the ATC Summit on July 30th. I'm very excited about that. And Rhonda, I want to thank you for your you're very honest talk. What you're doing in our community, and for taking time to share all of this with us today. Conversations Conversations like this remind us that protecting kids and supporting families is something we all have a role in. And I want to thank everyone who's listening. And because of conversations like this and continuing to have conversations like this, it's harder for the bad things that happen to stay hidden.
Yeah.
And I do want to remind everyone to check out her TEDx talk. I'm going to share the link down in the comments. I'm going to share it on my website as well as the QR codes. So thank you, Rhonda.
Thank you. Thank you.